when you think about the aftermath of a storm, there's still a storm left behind. If you've been in a hurricane or a tornado or any of that, guess what? There's debris, there's stuff that's got to be cleaned up, and put away. And even in any catastrophic event, in missions, we like to say that sometimes the help is the next catastrophe. Because as we witnessed in the Great Smoky Mountain fire, after the fire, and people were so generous, and they sent us all the stuff they no longer wanted to be distributed among people who had no home, that created the second catastrophe, because there's more stuff that you did not know what to do with and how to distribute than you could possibly imagine. So just because you come through the storm, when the storm is over, doesn't mean that there's not an aftermath to it. And sometimes the aftermath lasts much longer than the storm lasted. And sometimes what you're going to learn today is that it can last from generation to generation, which is a little bit unsettling, but it's the truth. And so we're going to go with a weird story today, which was a storm event, but we're going to start with the story of Noah. Remember Father Noah and Mrs. Noah, because bless her heart, she never had a name. So Mrs. Noah. And so tell me about Father Noah and Mrs. Noah. So somebody give me the rundown on their story. What made them infamous?
The flood.
All right.
I don't want to be a name.
What did Noah do?
Built the ark.
Built an ark because
God asked him.
Yes.
God told him to. All right. Why did God pick Noah?
Don't know.
He was a righteous man. Remember, he was a righteous man in the eyes of God, and God picked him. Now that may sound like a good thing, but then he had to go build this tremendous ark, and there's very specific instructions for how to build it. And I think someone has built a replica of that in Kentucky. Is it in Kentucky that there's an ark that's been built there? And so, and the thing, he gathered up animals, and I saw a funny comic yesterday. I have to tell you this. It was two animals sitting on the side, and the ark is setting sail. And one of them looks at the other one and goes, "Oh, was that today?" It's really funny. But anyway, so I sent that to my son because that's my proverbial son. "Oh, was that today?" So anyway, so a little sidebar. But anyway, so coming back, so they put these animals on. The rain began to fall. And for 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell. And remember, Noah kept sending the dove out to see if there was any land. And he came back with the branch finally in it. Now, I think it's ironic, and I've shared this with groups before, but we always make that beautiful flood story into nurseries, which makes no sense, because if you've ever been a part of a flood, it's ugly. There's bloated bodies, there's bloated animals, there's dead things, there's, in our case, electric wires. There's nothing beautiful, cuddly, cozy about that. But somehow, somewhere along the line, we decided to make that into a nursery. And my children someone gifted us a little beautiful Noah's Ark night lamp that sat in their room, but it really was not a beautiful time. It was a kind of an ugly time. So when they come back, they're, supposedly the only righteous people left. And God makes a covenant with Noah that he will never again destroy the earth. And that's where we get the sign of the rainbow, right? Okay, now we're going to talk about what happened after the storm with Noah. So let me go into the PowerPoint for today so that we can move into, whoops. I picked the wrong thing. You think after many times I've done this, I'd get it right. But, okay, so we're going to move on and talk about after the storm. And that is found in Genesis in the 9th chapter, verses 18 through 27. And we're going to kind of look at this in parts, if you will. And the first part of the story is this. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. Now, we're not going to get into the whole story about this because remember, there were still people on the earth, that the world, as Noah knew it, that there was a great flood in that time period because other archaeological evidence gives evidence to it. But the whole world, as we know it, was not destroyed. The whole world, as Noah and his community knew it was destroyed. But when we said that they were going to be the father of, from them, all the people, we're really talking about the beginning of that group of people called to be God's people. So this is the start of the Noahic covenant. Now, Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. And when he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Now, some of your translations will have that written differently. And their translation truly means, instead of uncovered, it means naked inside his tent. Uncovered, you would skim right over that thinking, okay, well, he doesn't have a blanket on. He doesn't have his warm, comfortable and so forth. So they're out of the ark and they come back and they begin their life again as God's righteous people. And it says he's a man of the soil. I love that. A fancy word for a vineyard. A vineyard owner, and he proceeded to plant a vineyard, and he drank some of its wine. So he over imbibed, and he is drunken, and he's laying uncovered in his tent. So move on to the story. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Now, see, isn't it interesting that in the first part, it says he lay uncovered. But then in 22, we learn, well, really, he was not just uncovered, he was naked. And he told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Zephath took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. And then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they could not see their father naked. Now, I want you to picture this for a moment. All right. So Ham has been in, he's seen his naked father laying out there in a drunken stupor. And he comes back out and he tells his two brothers that dad has over imbibed. In fact, he's laying in there with no clothes on. And the two brothers then, actually get a cloth in between them, and they begin to walk backwards. And I'm just picture this, trying to inch their way backward, and then let this cover drop over their father. And then they weren't looking at him. That to look at him was a despicable thing to do. So hold on to that. And then the last part of the story says this: when Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be to Canaan. The lowest of the slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Zephath's territory. May Zephath live in the tents of Shem. And may Canaan be the slave of Zephath." Okay, so we're automatically leaping a generation here if you did not notice. The curse was not upon Ham, the brother who came inside his father and went out and told about it. The curse was on his son, Canaan. And Canaan would bear the curse that Noah is putting on his family, not Ham. He would bear the curse, and he would become subject to the two uncles, Ham and Zephath. And so, the story of Ham just kind of disappears from it, doesn't it? So let's go back and let's just talk about this part of the story again. Now, if one would think about Noah, and so I just want to take the flood story of Noah and this piece of the story of Noah and try to make some sense out of them. Because if you look at the two of them, they're very different stories. In the first part of the story, Noah is righteous. He's the most righteous person on earth, that God has called him to save himself and then to repopulate that portion of the earth with the coming ancestors of God's people. Okay, so we've got, this great story that started along this line, and Noah's the one to carry it forward. Then compare that to the Noah that we now see, that now he's laying in a drunken stupor, shamefully in his own home. And so some of the things that we can take away from this is just because you've been righteous in one case doesn't mean that you're going to be righteous in all ways, right? And so, we can't make that assumption. So which is he righteous or is he a sinful man? Well, we're going to talk about that. The reality is that to be a righteous person means that when you're obedient to God, you don't get to say, I'm going to be obedient today and tomorrow I'm going to take the time off. I'm just going to be righteous through this situation, but not through that situation. God will understand. That to be righteous takes this concerted effort, and it takes this effort every day. And it brings to the awareness that we can be just as vulnerable in the storm, which we talked about last week, of how being in a storm makes you vulnerable. But also, once the storm is past, we let down our guard, and another storm can make us just as more vulnerable, or, what happens after that. And so we have to watch our vulnerability to step on the slippery slope, to go down the wrong path. It's always got to be always attentive to that. And sometimes temptation can be the most alluring when there's not a storm going on. And so if we just take that and put that into our current life, one of the things that this pandemic has demonstrated to us is the spending habits of people. That people were outspending income by a pretty large measure. They were not saving for an extreme measure. And then a pandemic hit, and suddenly people who've never been on the receiving end of anything that spoke of charity or need suddenly found themselves with no savings banked, no way to make it without this steady salary, no way to go through the next thing. And so we talk about people getting ready to be evicted from their homes, and people getting ready to have their cars taken back, people showing up at food banks and food pantries that never did before, because for them, spending was always nip and tuck, and they never had anything set aside for the other days. But, also spending can lead us into a storm. There are people who overspend on credit, become debt ridden, because it was a good time. They were just going to have a good time. And then they've ended up saddled with this. Sometimes, even then we think of relaxing outside the storm, where I just kind of let everything go. I don't need to attend church. I don't need to stay committed to community. I don't need to involve myself with that thing. And what we're doing then is shoving off and sloughing off and neglecting some very key things that give our lives routine and order and a necessary obedience to them. I always think of, people who work out regularly. If you work out regularly, it takes you weeks and weeks to begin to see the difference in your body and toning and exercising. And if you decide, well, I'm just going to take 2 weeks off, going to cut off on the exercise and so forth, man, to get back, you lose what you gained much quicker than the time it spends to gain that. And it's much harder to build yourself back up to that. And so, and sometimes when things are calm and there's not a storm in the midst of things, we find that we can kind of give up our spiritual disciplines. We don't really need to I'm going to spend a lot of time in prayer. Things are good. We don't need to talk with God, and I don't need to bank any scripture, and I don't need to participate in small group, because everything is really going on. And then that crisis, that storm hits, and it sends people scurrying back because they realize that their soul has been adrift and they weren't aware of it. And so that's when temptation has its means, upon us, is sometimes after the storm event. And one of the other things that this story about Noah teaches us that's really important is that the Bible is full of real and imperfect people like us. And so we laud that Noah was totally considered righteous, but we realize that even the most righteous amongst us, if they're not careful, can fall into an abyss that they maybe didn't see coming. And so this part of the story, I love that God, in the inspiration of the word, didn't leave Noah sitting in the ark with the flood waters abating. He took us back from the storm into the real life of Noah. So we can see that Noah was righteous before the storm, and he needed to be continued to be righteous after the storm as well. Now let's talk about what made him seem unrighteous. And part of it, we got to go back to our Jewish understanding, and that is the culture of shame. Shame, and it's still very much in the Middle Eastern countries in particular, and into many Jewish families to this day. But the idea, the culture of shame was very, very prevalent. And shame and honor were steeped in this particular culture. And it was true of all the places kind of along the Mediterranean there. That's why when you see about Paul going into areas of the Mediterranean where people just almost lived abundantly outside of anything that reeked of shame, he's kind of bringing this message back in there that, no, not anything goes. You were never meant to live as people like that. And what the culture of shame gave to people in community was it gave you a sense of belonging and unity to be a person of honor versus a person of shame. You did not want to be the one who brought shame upon yourself, because then that brought shame upon your clan or your patriarchal family. And that would send you outcast. So you no longer belong to that particular patriarchal community. And it created disunity within the patriarchal family. Now, some of you may have grown up like I did. Healthy shame was kind of a part of the culture in which I grew up. I think it was much more prevalent in decades of the past. Now, and I will pause to say there is a bad part of shame, the shame that devalues you, it makes you feel you're not worthy, and it really makes you feel second class. But what shame does in its healthiest level was to understand that my actions do affect other people. And so I remember growing up thinking, as a young person, I had opportunities to go and do some things that probably weren't in my best interest. But I'll never forget that one of the reasons I did not do it is I didn't want to have to face my parents and realize that I had let them down and brought shame to them through my actions. And maybe some of you can relate to that same thing. So you can see that this culture, because the opposite of shame is honor, when you brought honor to your group, that gave you this sense of belonging and unity inside that particular group. It also, as was in Noah's case before this particular incident, give them position and authority. You who tend to live a more righteous life, who are doing things for the common good of your family, your unit, are elevated in position and authority because you've trod those walks of temptation. You've known what that feels like to do that. And so it's giving them this sense of, the older I get and the more experiences I have and continuing to live with honor, then the more respected I am within my patriarchal circle. And the older I get, then the more authority that I have. The opposite of honor and reverence is shame. And what comes out of that is not position and authority, but punishment or curse, as in the case of Noah. He brought a curse not upon himself, he brought the curse upon his grandson. Because and so we may talk about that more in a minute, but why the grandson instead of the son? But that there is an action that when you brings that upon your family, then there has to be some punishment or curse in order to rectify the situation. Otherwise, you are cursed by whatever their action was. So here, Noah, what his son did was the wrong thing. It wasn't that Noah was unrighteous because he became drunk. The whole scene of this was not Noah's drunkenness. It was Ham's response to his father's drunkenness. And we infer from scripture that when Ham went out and told his brothers what it was, that it carried Noah's shame outside the tent and made it public knowledge. And in making it public, then his brothers thought they needed to take care of it. And so Noah is incensed. And so when you're incensed because you have brought shame upon the family, then you're going to issue this punishment or curse associated with that. Because the reality is shame cannot be undone. Only retribution or punishment is going to be the answer for that. Had Noah not acted that way, if Noah had not brought and held Ham accountable in some way, then the shame would have fallen upon him. And so this is a way to kind of keep the shame probably where it was. Now, there's an odd twist to this particular story when you look at it and when you do some comparative biblical looking, because what we're seeing in this case is this comparison of Adam and Noah. Shame, both experienced a fall. Both did something that they knew better than to do. The second thing is that both of them understood the shame of nakedness. You know, for Adam, that would make them look upon themselves in a different kind of way and be aware of that. And so for Noah, it was the same curse of being naked. In both of these events, the story of Noah and the story of Adam and Eve, would cast long-range consequences for generations to come. So it didn't just stop in that particular thing. Now, when I talk about nakedness, the human body was meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be appreciated. But when the early people became aware of their nakedness and began to cover it, that shows that lust, deceit, sexuality, and all that entered into humankind. And so when the Jewish culture, to see someone naked was to see them in a place that brought disrespect to them. And so for him to see him and then go and tell this was the multiplication of the story. For the consequences, when we look at that, for Adam, remember, he was separated from God and all his descendants. He was cast out of the garden. He no longer had a day-to-day walking relationship with God. And God goes very silent for quite a long time, in terms of that. For Noah, it's going to ultimately divide his family, and all the ensuing descendants from his family are going to be there. And we talked about this curse of Ham is passed on to his son Canaan and all his descendants. And they will become known then as the Canaanite people. Now, the question is, well, why was the curse not upon Ham? Why was the curse upon Canaan? Well, at its basic level, Ham, speaking as a parent, do what you want to me, but do not hurt my children, because that's even a graver harm to me than it is that if you inflicted that harm upon me, physically. And so this was like the ultimate curse, because in essence, it is on Ham, but it is on Ham that it will pass his descendant after descendant. And the first descendant of Ham is going to be Canaan. And Canaan will bear forth a group called the Canaanites. Now, you'll recall from scripture that the Canaanite people were those who lived in the land of Canaan. And it's an area that today we would know as modern day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. But this is the land that God promised the Israelite people when they were exiled from Egypt. When he tells Moses to take these people and to go forth, it is to the land of Canaan that they're going to be going. And remember, it's the land of Canaan that they have to get rid of all the people. So now we know how it is that God felt about the Canaanite people. And we read this in scripture in Exodus. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So they're all lumped into this big group of people who occupy this land now that God has promised to these people. And so they're going to have to be annihilated. So it's like this curse, this infighting tribal group of people. And there's a lot of information about the Canaanites if you go and research that historically. But the Israelites, this is what's important to this story, is the group who would become the Israelites, those who fled Egypt, would see that the land of Canaan was the rightful possession of the Israelite people because God promised it to them. And so it did not matter about Noah's covenant with God at this point. Canaan, for all intents and purposes, has been cast out of the garden. It will not be his descendants who are now becoming the Israelites. He will become his own group of people. They deeply believed that the Canaanites were evil and that it was God's plan for the Israelites to conquer and enslave them. And even into the New Testament, you will see that for a long time, we hear the stories of the Canaanite people. We hear the story of Jesus talking to the Canaanite woman. That's the one, you remember when there's the scripture in Matthew about a Canaanite woman wanting the scraps from the table. And Jesus says something like, you do not give to dogs, what is holy. And so there's the story. And so you see this great divide that not only is like from the land of Noah, but continues on thousands of years later, and even into the story of Jesus. And unfortunately, today, when you talk about a long-ranging consequence of a storm, Israel continues to fight with its neighbors and the descendants of this ancient tribe and others like them, even unto this day. Now, a similar story to this, of course, is the story of Ishmael. Ishmael, another family breach in the midst of a storm which was created not by these boys, but by their ancestors. Ishmael would become Islam religion over time. And so we have these long range things that continue the storms, even after the initial storm was over, and you would have thought everything was settled. Well, it certainly it wasn't. So I want to stop for just a minute before we kind of move on and move more into modern times to just see what are your reflections upon that story. How many of you knew that it was from the descendant of Noah that the Canaanite people came?
I can't figure out why he was mad. His son covered him up.
He wasn't mad at the son that covered him up. He was mad at the son who went out and told his brothers. The sons who covered him up, they got blessed. If you look back in that passage, they were blessed. But the son of Ham was the one that was cursed. It was Ham that saw him and went out and told his brothers.
Okay.
What do you think Ham should have done?
Covered him.
And kept his mouth shut, right?
Yeah.
Now I have a question. What does that tell us about the continuation of stories about people?
You'll listen. If it's something embarrassing, you'll hear it over and over and over.
And you better just keep your mouth shut, right?
Yeah.
See, I'm just, I can just see, these brothers together, and maybe it was an innocence that Ham went out and go, boy, Dad really tied one on last night. But there was, but that was such a disrespect to the honor of the father. Because remember, these are deeply shame-driven patriarchal people. And so to go and basically slander your father, even though it was the truth, out even within family circles, was, kind of God's way of going, don't do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there was something dishonorable about what he did, but by the time you spread the story, you multiplied the dishonorability, if there is such a word, of the whole act. Well, what do you think of this curse put on Canaan?
Oh, I don't like it because it talks about the sin of the fathers. I thought we didn't think that was true, but it sure is true in this.
I want to get back to that's a good point, Mary. And I want to get back to this whole conversation about sin of the fathers and, multi-generational, kind of things that kind of come upon. But that any of you feel, that Canaan kind of got the raw deal?
Later on in the Bible, it says Ham had 4 sons. Was Canaan the youngest?
Yes.
So he not only picked his son, is there any significance in picking the youngest son?
I don't know. And I'm like you. I don't know why I would have picked that one. I don't know. I'm guessing it's because he was of that age. I don't know. Maybe he had yet to marry, and maybe if Canaan had died without procreating, that would have been the end of it. I don't know. That's a good point. I just think it's funny, we read scripture and we kind of have skimmed over, or maybe it's just me. For years, I never caught that the land of Canaan that God promised to the people was from one of the descendants of Noah. And that these were the, hated people that in the book of Joshua, we'll see God given authority to kill. It's kind of troubling, frankly, I think, I think it's kind of troubling. It's a hard story to hear about these, relational things. But the thing about it, and kind of what it does begin to show us, is that when we talk about being righteous and doing the right thing, we begin to see that there's very long range consequences to some events. And I think that if there's anything in this story that we want to pick out, it's 2 things. One is that being righteous like Noah is, in seeing that ensuing generations do that, is a full-time conscious effort on our part to not let, kind of your guard down. But the second thing that you pull out of this is the reminder that none of us live in a vacuum, that what we do can affect another person and for years and years to come. And I think sometimes we forget that because we think it's so much about us. And it can be from anything that's a minor thing, to a much longer thing. But, and so for the rest of our lesson today, I kind of want to talk about that latter part of what we do, of always looking ahead, not just in the now, but in the yet to be. And if we are kingdom people who are living with the understanding of what heaven should be like, and that we're, trying to have one foot in heaven, but we also have to live this earthly part, is how do we kind of bridge those 2 things together? And so I want us to begin by talking about, what's some of the long range things that we, some messes that we keep making that we've got to clean up. So, the storms that, we've created that still need to be cleaned up. And this is where I'm thinking about Shem and Zephath. When Ham spilled the beans, and it makes you wonder, when Ham came out and told this story about the dead being in there naked and drunk, how many other people heard the story? Or was there fear that other people would enter the tent and see this? So this was not a mess that they created. The brothers did not create it. His brother created it when he told everybody, or Ham could have just stood guard over the tent and said, it's not a good time to go in and see Dad right now. And no one would have been the wiser. But they felt responsible to go in and clean up this mess that Ham had made. So it makes me think it was a more public proclamation than just telling the 2 brothers. But the 2 brothers, because they live in this culture of honor and respect, tried to clean up the mess. Well, sometimes we, living today, we are people who have to clean up the messes left behind to us by former generations. One of them, Robin's first job, he's an environmental engineer, and his first job was working for the state of Tennessee, helping to regulate the coal mining industry in terms of strip mining, and seeing that the land was somehow reclaimed to make it that it could survive the rape that had been done upon the land in strip mining. And up until that time, many areas, particularly in Upper East Tennessee or in certain parts where there's been a lot of coal mining and stripping, the land was just left. They stripped the coal out of it and just left it. And so runoff would come down from there, erosion, it was tainting the water supplies. It was a long range impact to what the effects of strip mining did to many who, like I said, clean the coal out of it and then just abandon it for other people to have to come in and take care of. And so into, like I said, do all kinds of things from water reclamation to soil reclamation. And, and they kind of moved off unscathed out of that. They didn't see any need. They took the profit out of it and kind of left the land. Another one that kind of popped into my head that's just kind of been recent for all of us in the forefront is the damage of what race relations, have done. How many things had been done in the past, to people of color, and we'll just talk about our country, it's not just in our country, that we're still to this day trying to rectify and bring some civility back to. I mean, it's now been almost, going over 150 years, kind of since we went through the Civil War period, and yet we're still trying to clean up all the harm and to find peace and all the hurt from all the practices that have been going on through the ages. So when we talk systemic racism, what we're talking about are things that this generation may or may not have done, but have been this cumulative effect of wrong messes that have been created by generations in the past. And that it's this ongoing effort, in one bill, that passed through Congress was not going to make everything all of a sudden all better. And we still got this mess that we're still trying to clean up. Personally, I think of women in ministry. Because somewhere along the line, the word got out that women could not be a minister, that women could not spread the word of gospel. To this day, I would love to think that in 2020, that is not even on anybody's forefront. But I can tell you that in small rural churches, it is the predominant continued thought that women have no place in ministry. That's in the Methodist Church, and in some denominations, they have no place in ministry anywhere except teaching children. And then I'm looking at what we're doing now with the LGBTQ question. How many people are we damaging and wounding in the process of this because we need to be right? And, what are some of these messes that are going to have to be cleaned up as part of that? So I want to stop then there and just kind of give you a chance to reflect upon those things that I brought up. But can you think of other things or reflect upon one of these that you think is a mess that's been created by a former generations or generations of people that created storms then that we're still trying to clean up today?
Climate control.
Climate, okay.
I mean, it's going on now. We're not trying to clean it up too much, but it's damaging.
Yeah, climate change, right. Okay,
Babies being born without fathers.
okay.
Drugs.
Okay.
What do you say?
Drugs, addictions.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say drugs. I think the whole issue of special needs people in general, the care of them, the acceptance of them, and I'm talking from children all the way up. Where is their place in society? And I know teaching, I would get these children, and I didn't have the know-how to do Asperger's or autism, and I had to really, now it's still kind of in the infant stages of development of how we teach these children. And you need special degrees and all that. And, I felt very unqualified, I guess is the best word to say, you're thrown in a classroom, you're thrown with kids, or you're thrown in society in general. And how do we treat these people? And I feel real sorry for them, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Well, and just about all those situations you all mentioned too. See, there's the situation, but then there's always the tentacles outside of that. So let me just go to your example, Nancy, talking about special needs children. What does it do to the financial burden of the family? What does that do to the school system? What does that do to society? Will they be able to be workable employment or care for those? Mary, I want to go back to your question about, passing the sins on to the father. See, I has really struggled with that scripture when, I was in Disciple. I'll never forget wondering, well, that just doesn't seem fair. But the reality is we do that all the time, whether we mean to or not. The child born to an alcoholic parent or an addictive parent will bear the brunt of that addiction. It'll be scarred in some way because of that. Children who are victims or whose parent commits suicide. It's the one thing children never get over, no matter how old you are. If your parent has committed suicide, it is a long-lasting scar, upon you that affects in all these other relationships. So when we talk about, and I'm not saying suicide's a sin, please don't hear me say that. But everything that we do, can it does affect somebody else down the line. And even if it's not a family member that does that, what if that intoxicated driver kills someone you love? Well, guess what? Now you and all the descendants from that are going to be affected by that. So it's not just that the storm is in our lives, but the storms in people's lives have the capability of going outside that initial pod of people and affecting many, many more people in the years to come. I don't know if you've ever watched that show on PBS. I think it may be called Roots. I can't remember, but it's the one that does all the DNA studies of celebrities. Usually they go and they look for all of their roots and so forth. It was really interesting. And I don't watch it often. Sometimes the TV's on when it comes on, but do you remember, Taya Leone, she was in Madam Secretary, the star of that. Her mother was adopted. And so they did this great study about her family. Well, come to find out, she knew her mother was adopted. So they found who her adoptive mother's mother was. And she was a school teacher who lived in a boarding house in a town where other men would come in frequently to do some kind of work there. And so from all their records and everything, they figured out who her birth mother was and who the birth father was, although the two of them never married. But this just reminded me of the long range effects that a young teacher has an affair with a man in a hotel. Both of them, it's not on any record per se. They could trace it back because of the records kept in the hotel. And then they could trace where each of those people went to work and what their things were. So my whole point is that none of us live in a vacuum, that what we do, whether we know it or not, does have long-range consequences. If we, venture outside kind of what God wanted us to be, we will, and so many diseases that we have now are because sometimes of storms that people created, and it went on from generation to generation. And so we're going to begin to see these things. And that, when things happen, they don't just happen and everything go back to the way it was. I'm thinking about the ash spill at TVA. Now we have, even though they keep trying to settle all the suits, but once they cleaned up the ash, it didn't make all the problems go away. Because now we have people who have pulmonary issues and so forth from these particular things. So I guess the whole point is is that I think we just got to live with a better awareness of that. And it's why things do get passed on from generation to generation, because so much of what we do can bring harm to one another. So let's just pause. I've talked, and let you all talk to that. Mm.
I think we get frustrated. I mean, I get frustrated and not necessarily confused a little bit though, but it's like, how can we're a society to me that we want to cure everything. I mean, we're America. We can solve any problem, but yet we've got a big problem right now and it's not getting any better. And I think that's frustrating for all of us. I mean, that we can't put a Band-Aid or cure it, no matter what.
But I think what this speaks to though is we're not asked to. What we're asked to do is to clean up where we are. To look at what mess am I creating that somebody may have to clean up later. And I guess it comes down to something as simple as what your mother used to tell you: don't make a mess. It's all how you define mess. But what are you leaving? What are you putting in your wake? And it makes me do, and I think what we're required to do is some self-assessment and really ask ourselves, is somebody having to put a cloak on me to cover up a mess I made? It's something to pause and think about. And, some big things come to mind, about, that an alcoholic or an addicted person, unfortunately, that part of their brain that is influenced most by addiction is the part that deals with reason, and that's very damaged. So it's hard for them to see that somebody is, having to put a cloak on to cover up for their messes. But, people do that. People cover up their messes. They justify their behavior. They explain their behavior away. They cover up literally the story about people because they don't want it known. And so sometimes I have to say, if somebody putting a cloak on me, or am I having to put the cloak on somebody else? Infidelity can work the same way. People try to justify their infidelity and to explain it, and it's just the way I am, or just blah, 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 whatever. And, and so, and somebody's covering for you. It could be a friend, it could be a relative or something like that. Impulsive spending, people cover for that. They just try to push it away, hide it, don't tell, what's happening to them, and why they can't do something is because someone within their family was overspending. The one that I think is really important, and it comes down, we're calling it all kinds of things in our social media news circle, but some of it is just called reckless gossip, where we are telling things that either are untrue or don't need to be told, that have no positive outcome other than we just need to dehumanize or bring down another person in order to bring ourselves up. And, and we're all can be guilty of that, me included. Reckless gossip, of just telling a story that puts somebody in not the best light, because for some reason that could make us feel better. It is something that all of us, I think, need to work on. Maybe even in a work situation, maybe, isn't it interesting how much we will cover for someone who's doing poor work? I'll tell you a guilty party of this, and that's churches. I will stand before you and say, because we have guaranteed appointments in the Methodist Church, that sometimes we pass on a bad pastor from church to church to church, even though we know they're a bad pastor. And that just shouldn't be done. Same's in school teaching because of tenure. We let a poor teacher stay year after year after year, damage child after child after child, because we're putting a cloak on it and covering it up. And so you see the long range effects of that. And I'm wondering, we saw it in the Roman Catholic Church in terms of sex abuse. We put a cloak on that and pretended it wasn't there. I can tell you numerous places that we can think about that. But we're putting cloaks on messes, and we're part of the problem when we do that. And And so it's hard to remember that sometimes we're being cloaked because of our own things and somebody's covering for us. But sometimes we're just as guilty of being, we're just trying to cover up somebody else's mess. We're justifying, we're coming alongside of them, in that. And, and we have to at some point stop and say, am I tired of covering for this? Am I just going to be forthright and speak what I think to be the truth and then deal, with that? And that's a hard step to do. But when you're in the midst of storms and coming on the other side of storms, you have to step up and say that. So I started by telling you all that in a catastrophe, sometimes the second catastrophe is all the stuff you get. It's hard to tell people, stop sending your stuff you're not helping, because it makes you sound ungrateful. But it's something that needs to be said. Now, I've told you all that when I went to work at that supply thing, there were enough toothbrushes for every person in the state of Tennessee to have at least one, if not two. I mean, stop with the toothbrushes, stop with the red stiletto heels and the bathing suits, stop with your used stuffed animals for children. Stop. You're not helping. But now, but we just kept smiling and taking their stuff. We even had a store, a manufacturing, they sent dozens of hams that needed to be refrigerated for people who had lost their home. They don't have a refrigerator. They're living out of their car or a motel room. We just sometimes got to stop and go, that's only making more of a mess than the mess that's already there. So one of the things we have to do, and I'll kind of close with this, is, how do we get through the messes? Well, and even looking at Noah's story, I am a little ticked at Noah. Noah took a mess that Ham created and he exacerbated the mess, to be quite honest. He should have just had a one-to-one with Ham and said, that's just not what you go and do. Ham, I expect an apology from you. I expect, but it was a tribal culture. I'm going to do it. But the reality is that if we're going to stop the continuation of storms from the big storms down to that, we have to give and we have to seek forgiveness. We have to bring reconciliation back. The more you just keep trying to cover stuff up, and the more you seek retribution, the bigger the storm becomes, doesn't it? And that's hard because we like to make everything even Stevens. And sometimes it's just not going to be. And, and we're going to have to, express, some mercy, ask for some mercy for ourselves, and extend mercy to others. And so there are many times, unfortunately, where I've had to go back and apologize to people where I said something I should not have said. I'm counting on their mercy. And every time I learn more from that experience. But there are also times where I've not been granted mercy. It cost me the relationship. So I've got to, we have to stop that. And along with that then is to seek reconciliation and replace division with unity. Now I know unity now has become a tainted word. I saw somebody write unity. Let me think what they said. Give me a break. Unity, give me a break. I'm like, man, maybe I'm a product of the 70s when Let Peace Begin With Me was popular and I actually believe that, But, if we don't, it will destroy us. It's one of the reasons, we've been emphasizing the word in our church of united, because we are a people in Concord Church of such great diversity that have such an opportunity to learn from one another and to grow to one another. United doesn't mean that we're all melded and we're just one big conglomeration of everything, but we're united in the one that calls us to be united in Christ. And we've come to him with various differences, various ideologies, various politics, various understandings. But we're seeking so hard to not let those differences divide, but that differences might enhance the overall, group of that. And so then the other part of this is, are we truly being people who seek healing? How can God's kingdom come if I can't be a healer in the process? If I lock my feet in and go, I am not moving from this spot, healing is just going to have to occur around me. Then you're just that festering kind of sore, within there. Which leads me to the next thing, is sometimes we just have to practice humility and to admit that I can be wrong on this. I can be grace-filled. I don't have to be the one that's right. I don't have to have all the final answers. And see, that's where, to me, Noah failed. Noah seemingly took no responsibility for what he had done, even though he's this great, righteous, biblical character. Nothing in that story tells me that he took any responsibility for his actions. Because if you don't want to be found naked in your tent, then don't put yourself in the position to be found naked in your tent. Right? That's like the people who are thrown in jail and they go, well, other people were doing it. Whatever the story, may be. There's got to be some humility of, for all of us, because, I'll just leave that. So thoughts on that?
Glenna, am I muted?
No?
Okay. I was just thinking how glad I am that I'm living under Christ and not at the time in Genesis, so that I have mercy.
Yeah, very true.
Back to living with the sins of your forebears. I feel you need to live with the consequences of what they did because it affects you. But you can't be held responsible or cursed or punished for their sins, in my opinion.
I think that's true. However, I will say this, particularly from what we now know. And there again, I don't think alcoholism is a sin. I don't think, it comes down to how we define these things, but I do think that there are things, that can genetically pass. They pretty much, I think, concluded that there is some genetic component to alcoholism. And so that is passed from generation to generation. Now, if you would
But I don't think it's because of somebody being evil.
No, I don't either. I don't either. But at the same time, we have to recognize within ourselves, I have this propensity, and therefore I must work against that. It's not like I can say, well, my dad was a sex offender, and so I guess I'm going to be a sex offender too. You just can't say, well, that's just what I'm going to be because this is my genetic predisposition. There is a way, to come back with that. But that means that humility, it's kind of like, well, you know what? I'm sorry, you can't drink like everyone else, but you can't. It's like, I can't run like everybody else, or I can't, do whatever. But that I would agree with you. I don't think it's that. That's what makes it. And I think probably, Jack, some of that's biblical interpretation, because anything that they considered wrong by their culture was sin. And we've come a long way in how it is that we define sin. Remember, sin is that thing that separates you from God. And it can be the most noble of things. But if there's that breach between, I could be an all-star marathon runner and I spend all my days running and I'm in great shape and there's really nothing sinful about that. But if I spend no time with God and all my time is spent, and that's what I worship is running and being known for that, whatever, then that to me makes it a sin. So I think it's a misunderstanding. Remember, to repent means to turn back toward God. So sin is anything that has kept you not in harmony and in spending time with God. I'm like Jamie, though. I think we've come a long way since those centuries. I sure hope so. But
I'm struggling with the other brothers throughout this whole story. How did Noah find out what had happened if the other brothers obviously would Ham would not have told it. So, the other brothers, in my opinion, got rewarded, but do they not, I'm assuming there was somebody else there that would have told Noah.
well, it says when he awoke and found out what his youngest son had done. So I don't know who told the story. That's what makes me think that when Ham came out and made this announcement, it was more than just the brothers. I think it extended beyond this nuclear family thing. Otherwise, I don't think the two brothers would have felt that they had to go in and try to cover up the situation. So I guess when he awakened covered, he started asking, where'd this come from? Because I'm wondering, it's wasn't like they picked up something inside there and did it. They carried something in from outside. So it's like, well, how did I get Zephath's cloak on me? And then they had to tell the story. I don't know. But
Well, if anybody was around and they saw two brothers walking in backwards with a cloak.
that's one of those things you kind of skim back. I loved it. The author of the book said that they were doing the Michael Jackson moonwalk with the cloak. That was pretty clever. I'd have tripped and fallen over that cloak if I was walking backwards.
Me too.
Were they also covering the mess?
What's that?
When they backed up and did that for their father, was part of that covering for the other brother?
Yeah, they were covering the other brother's mess. And that didn't help anything.
Mm-mm.
All that did was make the father know that, oh, now lots of people know this story. So I also, now if he was as drunk as they say that, so that he passed out asleep, on there, I'm wondering, was he like hungover when he issued this curse? Did he ever wish he could take the curse back? And it kind of speaks to what kind of power did he have to bring this curse, upon people, because the curse that, was laid upon Adam was from God. This curse did not come from God. This curse was uttered from Noah.
Sort of wish you hadn't said what you just said. Maybe the Bible should be sent back for a rewrite.
No. Yeah. But I think, my guess is though that when the curse came, Canaan would have been cast out. He would have had to form his own thing. And so he would become this fighting group of angry people, but that was wounded by this thing with it, and how much of our fighting and infighting comes from deep wounds. So it kind of makes you think about that, doesn't it? And what we do to people that, people when backed into a corner will come out fighting. And so I'm sure it was like, well, I'll just show you guys. I don't know. Interesting story. You're going to think about this the rest of the day, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I never knew that all happened.
And you thought the Old Testament wasn't interesting. So, okay, well, let me tell you, the next 2 weeks, we will not be doing Zoom for the next 2 weeks. I will send you a lesson to do at home because these are what we call standalone lessons. So something that you can work on and reflect on upon your own. And then can you believe we're into Advent?
No.
So I'm giving you the Thanksgiving week off, and I thought, well, I'll just give you the week before that off too. But we move into Advent, and we're going to be doing Light of the World, A Beginner's Guide to Advent by Amy Jill Levine, who is the professor from Vanderbilt. That's the Jewish scholar. So I did a portion of her work last year, and so it's really interesting. And so I hope you'll enjoy it. I have ordered books, and so I will leave them out when I get here in the tubs outside. And there'll be 2, so be careful, because I'm also doing for Sunday worship, a Sunday class that I make available to Sunday school classes, is Adam Hamilton's book, Incarnation, Rediscovering the Gifts of Christmas, or Rediscovering the Significance of Christmas. So I'll have that book out there too. So if you do both studies, get both of them. If you do only one, get one, and you don't have to have any of them.
All right, Glenn, I've got to ask you something, but
Okay.
is she not a Christian?
Is who?
Our study, the one we're going to do.
She is not. She practices in the Jewish faith, but she's the teacher of New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School.
Yeah, we had her in our Sunday school class, and I always think, why do we have a non-Christian teaching us?
Well, because Jesus was a Jew, speaking to Jews. All the words of Jesus are not Christian. They're Jewish words. And so she brings the interesting thing, the thing that I enjoy about our work is, if we can't understand that Jesus was a Jew speaking to Jews, we'll never truly understand the whole depth of what he was trying to tell the people and why that's significant for us. The only difference is she doesn't necessarily consider that he is the Messiah, but
that's a big difference.
It's a huge difference. But in other ways, though, keeping to the teachings of Jesus, she deeply believes in, because we call ourselves Judeo-Christians, because many of the teachings that Jesus said for his disciples were Jewish teachings. Care of one another, feeding one another, clothing the naked, welcoming the immigrant. Those are all Jewish words that we do as followers of Jesus. So
What's her last name? Oh, sorry. What's her last name again?
Levine, Levine.
Okay.
I was thinking of her this morning in light of your meditation this morning. And she, in one of the programs that we saw in our class, indicated that the Lord's Prayer was the perfect Jewish prayer for that time.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of an interesting, I never thought of that as a Jewish prayer.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be, one of the things, we can never separate Jesus from his heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Because, he was steeped in that. That is who he was. He came up in the rabbinic school. And so everything, and when he opens his statement by saying, I have not come to do away with the law, I have come to basically expand the law. He was in this bridge between what the law, as the Jewish people knew it, and what the law would become as followers of his. So it just really gives clarity. It would be like trying to say to me, you could plant me in, some other part of the world, but you're never going to, and I could go live in India. Let's just say I go live in India. And so I'm going to teach something in the India schools system there, but you can't displace who I am in the midst of that. My teaching is going to be influenced by everything in my past and everything of my religion. And so I think that's what she speaks to. And I think she's just given a whole lot of, we keep turning Jesus' words and making them be something that fits our culture instead of fitting and being truthful to what Jesus' words really meant for, in reference to what he was telling the people at the time. And I think we have to be really careful about that. Because, one thing Jesus did not do, and this is, kind of controversial, for people, Jesus, in some faith denominations, all we care about is our personal relationship with Christ. And once that's done, we're done. Check, got the box. I got a personal relationship with Christ. But in the Jewish faith, and I think in the Christian faith, a relationship with God that does not transform into a relationship in community is not a full relationship. When the relationship is only about me and God, and there's nothing that comes out of that to embrace community, then I missed a big portion of what it was. And I think that's what Jesus' kingdom was really about. That's why we speak so much in kingdom language, is that we're still trying to bring that together. So anyway, that's a good question, Mary. Thank you for asking. So full transparency as far as I know, but anyway. Okay. Well, let's close today with a prayer, and then I will see you back here in 2 weeks, but I'll see you in other.
I remember last Thanksgiving, you said you were not cooking. Are you cooking this Thanksgiving?
Our daughter is cooking, and we're going to her house for a change. It's just our daughter and son-in-law and our son. So we pared down the bigger family gathering because of COVID. And nope, I'm not.
Good for you.
I'm spending the next 2 weeks working on web page redesign. If you've
Oh, boy.
woohoo!
Yeah, I'd rather cook.
Yeah. Speaking of a mess, yeah. It gets tiring trying to live in dual worlds of virtual and real world. And you'll have to pray for your staff. Today every year we do a what we call a